Jane Avril was born as Jean-Louise Bedon on the 9th of June 1868. I will pronounce her name Jane because she likes it that way. She was born here on the street behind me in Belleville, Paris. She was the only child of Léontine Clarisse Bedon, a French woman born in 1844, and Italian nobleman Marquis Luigi de Font. Jane was born at 5 in the morning. Delivering her is midwife Catherine Verel, who is 50 years old. Signing Jane's birth document are two men. One François Perez, age 33, a linen manufacturer who lives in the same building as Jane and her mom. And Jacques Désiré Aubreton, a 33-year-old tailor. Jane's mother, Clarisse, is listed as an unmarried milliner. She was actually a part of a strata of society known as Grande Horizontale, courtesans of the Second Empire. Her nickname might have been La Belle Elise. Jane's parents, Luigi de Font and Clarisse, are said to have separated 2 years after Jane's birth. Jane is sent to live with her mother's parents in the countryside outside of Paris, in Ètampes. There she goes to a convent school, and she describes later in life how she as a kid saw the nuns as some kind of otherworldly beings whom she could not believe ate, slept and went to the bathroom like normal humans. The Franco-Prussian War takes place in 1870 to 71, and her grandparents are forced to host Prussian soldiers within their home. Jane remembers how she played around and sat in the soldiers' laps. When Jane is 9, both her grandparents die within a short period of time from one another, and her mother comes to reclaim her and take her back to Paris. They are said to have lived here at first, on Rue de Caumartin, in the Paris city centre close to the opera. Jane's mother is said to have been housed here, courtesy of a congressman. From the very start of living with her mother, Jane is frightened. It is unknown of how much contact they had had up until this time. Her mother's courtesan status had been replaced by that of a regular sex worker, and her mental health was severely bad. She was erratic. She would pace from room to room. She would read her fortune in teas or cards or whatnot, and she'd be furious at the result. All this in front of her daughter. Jane was forced to clean and open for her mother's clients. She would be sent to beg in courtyards away from their neighborhood. Her mother regularly beat her, and she made sure not to beat her and leave marks on her face or any other parts of her body where the abuse could be seen. But she left her frail little body black and blue. The old woman Jane would shiver and tremble when she spoke of this period in her life. One of her mother's clients arranges so she can go to a school which is run by the Desir ladies. She loves it there. She loves to learn, and she loves to be away from her mother. The teachers even let her be enrolled a longer time at their own expense. She stays up until her first communion, and then she actually escapes from her mom. She escaped to an elderly couple whom she had met through her school, and they get her admitted here to the Salpêtrière hospital. She's admitted on December 28, 1882, at age 14. She's first listed as an epileptic. She is put in the care of Jean-Martin Charcot, the famous neurologist, after she's developed nervous twitches and involuntary jerky movements. She's placed in the ward for hysterical women, actually adults, despite the fact that she's still a child. She's eventually diagnosed with Sydenham's chorea, also known as St. Vitus's dance. The Salpêtrière hospital was a city within a city, with a capacity of 10,000 patients in the 1880s. People lived their entire lives behind these walls. And Jane herself loved it here. She describes it later in her life as being a paradise. This testifies as to just how horrendous her life with her mother must have been, as the Salpêtrière is sometimes been described as a rather scary place. She attended school again, and once a week there was a gymnastics class in which she excelled. She was also the teacher's favorite. There is no mention of other treatments being subjected to her, such as ovarian compression, hypnosis, hydrotherapy or electroshock. One patient taught her the basics of classical dance. Jane was a kind of pet to the nurses and the other patients and the doctors. A little favorite. She was, after all, a child or a teenager in a ward for adults. One time she met actress Sarah Bernard there, who was there at the Salpêtrière studying the mad for future roles. Jane writes on how the women would let her in on their secret. That is, some of them at least, faked their hysteric fits. And that Jane would be included in this by doing ovarian compression on them just in time for when the doctors were approaching, so that they would temporarily gain their sanity. She stays at the Salpêtrière for 2 years. In this time, her mother does visit her, but Jane is in such a bad state after the visits that they thereafter become supervised. In 1884, when Jane is 16 years old, there is a so-called Mad Ball held here at the Salpêtrière. It's a ball open to the public where they can party with patients and personnel, except for the ones that are deemed too violent. Such a thing to us today comes off as extremely unethical and very, very strange. However, at this ball, Charcot's daughter lends Jane a dress, and it's her first time at a ball or dance event. And she's taken by the music, and she twirls around and around, and dances. And she dances like from her own insides. And when the music stops, she wakes up and sees how everyone's standing around her, applauding. This could often happen to her, that she would fall into a trance, but this was her first time that she did so, and it became sort of her method, that she would have often continue to dance and twirl around after the music had actually finished. She's discharged in July of 1884. We can never know if she was indeed sick with Sydenham's chorea, or if it was ailments that were brought on by her mother's abuse. One trait stayed with her though, that her biographer Shercliff writes about: a curious and fascinating twitch of the nostrils, which made her wrinkle her fine little nose like a rabbit. Her hell restarts as she's sent back to her mother, who has promised the doctors at Salpêtrière not to abuse her child. Her mother tries to pressure the father of Jane for money by bringing Jane to him, but he is already ruined and in ill health, and soon thereafter he goes back to Italy and dies. Her mother then tries to pressure Jane into sex work, and when this is unsuccessful, she is beaten severely. Then one day she actually does escape for good. She escapes from her mother and never ever sees her again. In 1885, she moves in with a medical student whom she'd likely met at the Salpêtrière. They share a room together at the Latin quarters of Paris. He is her first love, and he proposes marriage to her. She writes later in life of him being her first sexual experience, and that it wasn't pleasant for her. They had a short romance before Jane comes home one day to find a woman by the stairs who says she's been seduced and abandoned by the man. Possibly she also had a child with him. Jane leaves him and leaves behind all gifts that he has given her. That evening, she goes and decides to throw herself in the Seine River. Societal conventions around chastity had left her with nowhere else to turn, or that was how she perceived it at least. After seeing half of a play in a theatre, she is harassed in the street by a drunk man who follows her. She runs into a gang of sex workers who help her be rid of him and take her in. The gang took her to the open-air dance hall Bal Bullier, here in the Latin quarters. There she is taken by the same sensation as at the ball at the hospital. She dances solo and twirls around and around in a trance-like state. She is recognized for this ability and becomes a profile in the neighborhood. During this period, Jane lives with different men and is supported by them. This can be misunderstood to us today. We must remember, however, that in her time this was extremely common. Actually, the norm was that women were supported by men in all classes of society. Jane's love life, as it reads to us today, comes off more like regular dating than sex work. She did, however, especially during this period in the Latin quarters, have sex for pay, which also was extremely common in her day and today and earlier in history, a way for millions of people to make ends meet. Sometime around this time, she meets English poet Robert Gerard, who would later write a biography on Oscar Wilde. Together they conjure up her new name, Jane Avril. Jane as the English version of her name Jeanne, and April, a month whose mood she felt very much connected to. And yeah, Jane, because she, as we will find out later, she is particularly fond of Englishness. She meets many of Paris' cultural celebrities. Some of them are still known to us in this day, like Oscar Wilde, Houssaye and Mallarmé. She also meets Polish poet Theodore de Vyssewa, who will become a close friend of hers and a platonic protector. Throughout the years, he will propose marriage to her again and again, and she'll refuse it. He writes about her in his novel Valbert under the name Marie. Jane and Theodore de Vyssewa live together for a while, platonically, and he has a great influence on her cultural development as he lends her books and takes her to concerts. Theodore de Vyssewa was a pioneer of the symbolist movement in France. He wrote several books and translated texts in up to 7 different languages. He was a big fan of Wagner. He is said to have married a woman very much resembling Jane Avril. In 1889, the World Exhibition opens. This is the exhibition for which the Eiffel Tower was erected. Jane works as a cashier at one of the attractions at the fair. She describes a bustling fair, open from noon to midnight, with music, the sounds of drums and laughter. There were people from all over the world, from countries such as China, Japan and Egypt. Jane saw Javanese dancers and belly dancers, She also went to the sculpture pavilion before her shift started to see the beauty of the sculptures and admire them. She saw fakirs doing fire dances and dagger dances, and they ate crushed glass and contorted. One day she suspects that there is thefts by the fakirs from a cash box, and to find out if this is true, she puts laxatives in the disguised as candy in the cash box, and she thereafter sees the entire fakir gang running for the bathrooms, even the boss. During this period, she also works as a so-called horseback belle at a hippodrome, a kind of acrobat on horseback who sometimes also drove a chariot in a manege, in a circus-like setting. She becomes friends with novelist Arsene Houssaye, who is 54 years her senior. Some sources state that she worked as his secretary. He told her stories of his youth, of parties in an era past, and Jane loved to listen to this, of stories of parties in the Second Empire. They would dine together in his big mansion, and he compared Jane to the muse of dance, and said that Jane was an incarnation of that very muse. On October 6th in 1889, the Moulin Rouge opens here on Place Blanche. This is a pleasure palace for all of Paris, high and low, rich and poor. A novelty of its time is that it's fully electrified, which in itself becomes an attraction. It had a garden with a smaller stage, where they had donkey rides. And in this garden there was a big giant elephant, which was hollow. It had been brought there from the World Exhibition of the same year. It also had attractions inside, as well as a bar. Every night at 10 p.m. in the big ballroom there was the quadrille, that is the cancan of its day. The dance started as the chahout in Paris in the 1850s. It was a couples dance, a duo dance, where two couples would battle each other with wild, rowdy movements. Chahout connoted chaos. It was, wild and raunchy. It predates the Offenbach tune that we nowadays think of when we hear the word can-can. In the 1880s, it became more focused on the individual performers and the performances of the women. And in the 1890s, we see the first big chahout can-can stars like Jane Avril and Blagolou, who would perform with her male partner Valentin Le Dessaussé, a man who was so agile and flexible that he was given the nickname Valentin the Boneless. The attraction of the quadrille at the Moulin Rouge was the individual performers, the entertainers, and the dancers who would have their own personal style and temperament. And they had nicknames such as the Gutter Grating, who was given this name because of the space between her teeth. There was also Glimmering Gold, Love Apple, and the Cheese Girl. The can-can dancing in this time was a way for women to gain some sort of independency and earn money on their own. The dance has elements of mockery of the general society and of institutions such as the military and the church. Jane Avril now dances professionally and is hired by the Moulin Rouge. She is given the nickname La Mélanite from an explosive due to her ecstatic dance style. This also links her to the Salpêtrière, a former arsenal. She refuses to use this name, but she's billed under it anyway. The director Siedler allows Jane more liberties than the other dancers. She can wear the colors that she wants and choose the style of her costumes herself. She wears red undergarments. The other dancers, They wear white. Her colleagues call her different and strange, and they name her Jeanne la Folle, Crazy Jane. She hears rumors about herself that she is of a good English family who has paid her a pension to get rid of her. Other rumors she hears is that she's on morphine, opium, and that she's anorexic. The other dancers are jealous of her and tease her for being different, but the Moulin Rouge boss Siedler provides her some sort of safety from the most harsh bullying. Here is a quote by herself on her dance and her style. "I don't look really pretty, although nice enough, I think. But it seems that a certain charm emanated from me. A disturbing charm, some said. Although, as it has been said to me so many times, I am almost sure I was very gracious. What I am completely convinced of is that I have always danced without any shamelessness. I dreamed while dancing, and for myself alone. I danced and I dreamed of pretty things that music suggested to me, and that I would never know or dare to express." I must describe in more detail the feelings that she describes in connection to her dance. She writes that music awoke in her an impulse she could not resist, and it carried her away. In her youth, she would be carried away by the music, and when she woke up from this state, she would feel a little bit ashamed and become shy over the fact that she let music take her and control her. But as a professional dancer, she could use this. She went into a trance-like state and improvised her dance art. She performed movements such as shaking her body, jerk, and suddenly contort. She sometimes alluded to her colleagues being right in calling her Jeanne la Folle, crazy or mad Jane. One time, Jane was offered to be filmed in a cinema studio, a novelty of this time. Her dance would have maybe been preserved for us, but she said no. She was, despite her outwardness as a dancer, still quite a shy and reserved person. The old Jane did write, though, that seeing one of her dances on film would have amused her. There was one table at the Moulin Rouge reserved for a certain Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, an artist from the south of France who had moved to Paris and Montmartres in 1882. He was from a noble family and would have become a count had he outlived his father. Inbreeding within his family had given him genetic disorders, which among other things made 2 bone fractures in his legs not heal properly when he broke them, the legs, in his teens. It is likely that Jane and Henri met here at the Moulin Rouge, as he was a regular here, and he admired her dancing. They quickly became friends. He would send for her day or night to come to his studio here on Rue Tourlac, the house with the big windows here just behind me. The sittings would start with dining, either at a restaurant or at his home and studio. Lautrec loved to cook and make strong cocktails, so strong that Jane pretended to sip them and pour the rest of the content into a jar or a pot. There was a special museum's table in the studio, which Jane loved. It had Japanese prints on it, carved animals, stones and shells. Lautrec's studio was so dusty that if she sat down in pillows on the divan, dust would emerge as she sank into the pillows. It was also full with just stuff, painting materials like easels and just about everything else. He would ask Jane to sing or dance for them in the studio as he observed her and sketched her. She was one of his favorite models, and between the years 1890 and 1893 He made lots of sketches, paintings, and prints with her. He was perhaps a little bit infatuated with her. She is shown in different roles in Toulouse-Lautrec's images. Dancing, of course, but also as a spectator of cabarets, as a wanderer, a kind of going to or leaving places, such as leaving the Moulin Rouge as her private self. One painting depicts her in conversation with other cultural personalities, also at the Moulin Rouge. And in one print, she's proof viewing a lithographic print. This one is particularly interesting, as in this picture, Toulouse-Lautrec gives Jane an eye, an artistic authority to oversee the lithographic print process. Contemporary writer Arsene Alexandre writes of them, painter and model, together, have created a true art of our time, one true movement and one true representation. She starts the year 1893 by playing Pierrot in the play L'Arc-en-Ciel, The Rainbow. This is her first experience of the theatre world, and her self-confidence is lacking. She's extremely shy and suffers from stage fright. She dances at Jardin de Paris, a dance hall run by the same people who run the Moulin Rouge. Toulouse-Lautrec makes a poster for the event. This poster will make her famous as a dancer and as the subject of Toulouse-Lautrec. It is through posters like this one that we today know the name Jane Avril, without knowing little or nothing about the woman herself. A quote by Paul Jean Toulet, a poet and writer who saw her dance at Jardin de Paris. She did a waltz, all by herself. Wearing a plain, somber dress, she appears in her rapid turns as something indefinably elegant and harmonious. From her hair to the tip of her toe, all vibrates as a whole. But then suddenly, she departs from her own rhythm, breaks it, and creates a new one. She seems never tired, always reinventing herself. This year, 1893, she has a nervous breakdown, or problems with her bronchi, or both. She spends time at Villepinte Sanatorium outside of Paris. Her devotee Theodore de Visseva pays for this stay and puts her there under the name Madame de Visseva. Wishful thinking on his part, and a practicality, as the nuns who run the place look down on unmarried women. Jane, however, tells Mother Superior parts of the truth, that she's not married, and she says she has done some theatre. The shocked Mother Superior says for her to not say a word to any of the others. But everyone found out. I wonder who told them. They entered her room without knocking, under some false pretext, to see Jane, the phenomenon, this fallen woman. At one Sunday service, the priest even says for everyone to say a special prayer for the woman dangerously ill and far from God. Everyone turns around and looks at her. They forbid her to go on forest walks, and she tells Theodore de Visseva on his next visit, please take me from this prison. I would rather die dancing. He does take her from the sanatorium, and they go on a trip to Toulon in the south of France. They also visit Kassel in Germany. But in Toulon, on the Riviera, they meet Theodore de Visseva's friend, the painter Renoir, who does some paintings and sketches of Jane. Their whereabouts are currently unknown. Jane and Theodore de Visseva do try and start some kind of love relation, but it doesn't work out, and they stay friends. Dating and love wasn't easy for Jane. as she wished to stay free. The norm of her time put a woman in one kind of cage if she married, and another kind if she didn't. Two of Jane's lovers actually spoke of killing both of them, because their love was doomed. One man, Alphonse Allais, a writer, even drew a revolver, which she had to maneuver out of his hands. In 1892, Jane lived on 69 Rue de Douai, off the slope of Montmartre, very close to the Moulin Rouge. Around 1892 to 1895, she lives around the corner from there, here on 19 Rue de Brussels. She lived here during the Dreyfus affair. She could see writer Émile Zola leave his house every day, as he lived next door. Her own personal viewpoints in the Dreyfus affair, if she had any, aren't known to us. I personally think she was on the side of Dreyfus. During this time, she's part of literary circles who meet regularly at the Chat Noir cabaret. They meet almost every evening and dine together like one big family. They discuss everything. Sometimes Jane also improvises a dance to a piano tune. The Moulin Rouge boss Siedler also hosted dinners on Sunday evenings in a big apartment close here to the Moulin Rouge. He would wield a big dipper, which he would serve soup with to everyone. And everyone was welcome, the highs and the lows. To these gatherings and others, Jane would bring Miss Houssaye, an English dancer named May Milton, who was also portrayed by Toulouse-Lautrec. They were inseparable. The Miss Houssaye came from when Jane was invited somewhere. She would ask, "A Miss Houssaye?" And could Miss also join? They were most certainly lovers. May had had lesbian relations, one with another woman also named May, and also portrayed by Toulouse-Lautrec, Irish singer May Belfort. Jane never wrote openly about them being in love or having had a love relation, but these evidences, sharing a room together, actually here on somewhere on Montmartre Hill, and being described as inseparable, traveling together, does indicate a love that is stronger than just friendship. She did protect May, took her under her wing, as May was new in Paris, and her way of taking care of her was to make one of her friends be the lover and protector of May when she was in a bad economic state. They traveled together. They went to London, where May and her family had her family, and Jane was included in the family life, which she loved. She also loved the city of London. Researching queer history can be tricky due to open life being hard or impossible in the time period in question. Jane, however, writes on some of Montmartre's queer scene. She writes that many of the female sex workers were lesbians, and she writes of a bar or a brothel for lesbians, which was a thing that existed. It was run by a woman named Amadine, who wore a man's collar, high tie, and looked more like an old magistrate than a woman, in Jane's words. Women who went there kissed her face before returning to her fellow friends. Another lesbian place was Brasserie La Souris, the Mouse, which was run by two elderly women who were big gossipers. The Scarab was a gay bar run by André Philippe, a cabaret for and by queer folk. It was often raided by the police, who took people with them there to their depot. Jane saw a show there once, and it was a miserable occasion when the owner had been raided the night before and was lying sick on a bed. Jane writes about what we today would call drag queens, and they took on like culture personalities or celebrity names and styles including Jane's. She was not super flattered over this fact. In 1896, she placed the role of Anitras in a theatre production of Peer Gynt at Nouveau Théâtre, present-day Théâtre de Paris. The play chronicles the journey of its titular character from the Norwegian mountains to the North African desert. Anitras is a Bedouin chief, daughter of a Bedouin chief. And Peer Gynt tries to seduce her, but she steals his money and his rings and leaves him. Jane performs barefoot and in Egyptian Arabic style dress-ish. Her method for the role is to not rehearse with the rest of the cast. She sits and views them as they rehearse, and she reads and rereads the script until she knows every role by heart. She then showed up at the premiere and embodied/improvised Anitras dance. Stage fright gripped her once again though. She described her heart was beating and racing, and that she suffered from memory loss when she entered the stage. Afterwards, in her dressing room, it took her a long time to recover from the intense emotions. This stage fright doesn't seem to be a problem at all for her when she is performing more freestyle at venues such as the Moulin Rouge. There is something with the feeling of being free versus locked in, following a script, it seems. She's very applauded for her dance, her role as Anitras, and admirers write in praise of it. Jane had a dental problem, and when Toulouse-Lautrec saw her swollen cheek, he burst out laughing and asked her if she was pregnant. This year, 1896, Jane returns to London, this time with a troupe consisting of 3 other dancers. She is also accompanied by her maid, and they stay for over a month in London. May Milton comes and meets them when they arrive. It is unknown what happened to May Milton hereafter. She danced for only 1 season in Paris, and then went to New York. Toulouse-Lautrec made a poster for her US tour. Even her birth and death years are currently unknown. So this meetup with Jane and her troupe in London is our last trace of May Milton. For this trip, Jane has a scheduled performance together with the 3 other dancers, Églantine, Cléopâtre and Gazelle. So she commissions Toulouse-Lautrec to make a poster for the event, which is held at Palace Theatre in London. Jane and Églantine are the 2 more skilled dancers of the troupe, and this evokes jealous rage in the 2 other dancers, Cléopâtre and Gazelle. Such a rage that it has to be handled by the manager of the place. Jane writes very romanticizing about England and the English way. In her eyes it was perfection and elegance. And she writes, ridiculous or comical looking people were left in peace there, unlike her own experiences of France. This period shows kind of subcultural interest in all things British, like language and culture, an Anglomania which Jane shared with Toulouse-Lautrec. Toulouse-Lautrec's own mother was also into this Anglomania, and she called her son Henry instead of Henri. They both spoke English quite well. Jane, however, spoke only a few words of English. In 1896, Jane discovers that she's pregnant. She knew who the father was, but never told anyone, or the man himself. So she retires from dancing and goes to a distant suburb of Paris to hide the pregnancy. Theodore de Visseva is her only visitor. She wears a wedding ring and tells people that her husband is in the military and that he's been called off to one of the colonies. While pregnant, she is said to have looked like a thread with a knot tied on it. Her son, Jean-Pierre Bedon, is born on the 17th of July, 1897. She described a yearning and a longing to care for him and to make his upbringing a better one than her own abusive one. But she had to earn a living, and her job was dancing. So she put him in the care of foster parents and went back to dancing. She did visit him regularly though. But as we shall see further ahead, he never really warmed up to her. At the time of Jean-Pierre's birth, Jane is listed at 15 Rue de la Terrasse, 20 minutes walking distance from the Moulin Rouge. It's unclear if this is the distant suburb mentioned by Jane's biographer, or if she simply returned there once the boy was born. One source states that the child was conceived on the night after the premiere of Peer Gynt. The foster parents lived in Normandy, and Jane visited them every week. In 1899, Toulouse-Lautrec makes the last work in which she is featured. It's a poster where she wears a dress decorated with a coiling snake. It was never used. It was possibly made to advertise for one of her performances at Ambassadeur or Jardin de Paris. That same year, she dances in Nice in the south of France with a transformation number, a dancing act which included several clothing changes. She reads in a newspaper that Toulouse-Lautrec has collapsed and has been taken to an asylum. She saw him a few months before this and was shocked at the physical changes in him. Jane feels that things are changing. Old dance halls either close or get remade. The emergence of things like the first metro, the first cars, and the increase of bikes in the city. A new century is at the doors. Sometime around this period, she contracts pneumonia and is very, very ill. But she does recover and continues her dancing life in the new century by touring France. She also performs at venues such as Ambassadeur, Alcazar de Ètampes, and Champs-Élysées. In 1901, she dances at her regular summer place, Jardin de Paris, alongside Swedish female impersonator John Lind, who is largely forgotten today. He appeared on stages abroad, but only once in Sweden. Female impersonation / drag wasn't popular back then in Sweden. John Lind is perhaps my next subject to bring to life. This was a side note about my fellow countryman, woman, person. In 1901, Toulouse-Lautrec dies at his mother's castle, Château Malromé, southeast of Bordeaux. Jane mourns him and remembers the man whom she owed her fame in her time and in present time. Around this time, she starts to actively date Maurice Biais, an artist, draftsman, and furniture designer. They are said to have had an on and off relation from around Jane's early 30s. He would propose to her again and again, and she would refuse it. He made a work featuring her, a poster of her dancing. His family did not approve of him eloping with a dancing girl. In 1902, she takes her son back from the foster parents and plans to start a life together with Maurice. Maurice gets a job at the design firm in New York. Jane and her son join him there. In New York, she has a foreboding feeling of this is not it. Jane and Maurice quarrel. Jane feels nostalgic for France, and after a month of longing, she goes back she takes her son and takes a boat back to France. On the boat, she dances on the bridge one night to an orchestra there. Jane and her son become very close friends with the captain. She telegraphs Oller, the owner of the Moulin Rouge, and requests that they play The Return of April when she arrives. She thereafter continues her engagements at the Moulin Rouge. Jane performs with her eccentric dances, as they are called, at Bouffe Parisienne, in the stage adaptation of Claudine in Paris, a novel by Galette, literary star of Paris, who was published first under her husband Willy's name. Colette caused a scandal here at the Moulin Rouge in 1907 when she kissed her female partner Missy on stage. The Moulin Rouge had been renovated and reopened in 1903 as more of a theatre space than a ballroom. This year, Jane performs in a quadrille at Opera Comique, and also here she performs here in a revue called Two Marchés, and also in the same year here at the Moulin in another revue called La Belle de New York. In this revue, the boss of Moulin Rouge, Fleas, wants her to pad her calves for a boxing scene. Jane is furious because her legs, slim and slender, perfect, the toast of Paris. But she pretends that she agrees, but she tears out the padding from the hoses which she has received without saying anything. Later the boss says to her, "See how much better it looks now." She also wins a competition in cakewalk dancing, a dance she had seen in New York. Her prize is a pair of corsets. Jane Avril never wore a corset, ever. In 1905, Jane travels to Madrid together with a troupe to perform there. The experience is not pleasant, as they are harassed in the street on many occasions. And when they are about to perform, the audience shouts insults at them and boos. Jane, however, starts dancing and wins them over, and they end the performance with the audience shouting bravo and applauding. Back in Paris, she's engaged again at the Moulin Rouge and Bal Tabaran. She lives with her son and dances to get money to start a family life together. Her son is now 8 years old. She dances a bacchanalia dance in the tragedy Dionysus by Gasquet at Théâtre de Œuvre. She's one of 4 Bacchant, Bacchus dancers. She dances to a lyre music and a flute, draped in textile and barefoot, the likes later linked to Isadora Duncan. She also dances at in a play called Masque d'Amour at Théâtre Sarah Bernard. Jane is 35 years old at this point and starts to refuse late night jobs, thinking of her health. She decides to settle down and restarts her relation with Maurice Biais once again. He turns out to be a gambler and a drunk, though. Quite the hassle and unpredictable. So Jane goes off with another man. She travels to Monte Carlo and other things. She allows this man to really spoil her, and she leaves Maurice devastated. When she does return, though, they reunite and do decide to settle for one another. Jane's last appearance at the Moulin Rouge was at the premiere of the operetto Claudine by Colette on the 13th of November 1910. Somewhere between 1906 and 1911, she moves to the small village Jouy-en-Josas, outside of Paris, close to Versailles. She moves here with Maurice and her son to a house. She quits dancing professionally, and her last recorded performance is at an exhibition by Art Nouveau potter Lachenal In 1911, Jane and Maurice had longed to settle down, and after having an on and off relation, they marry in 1911. Maurice adopts her son, who thereafter carries his surname. Jane's son was sickly, and he had fits of temper which reminded Jane of her own mother. Jane and Maurice was a little bit like a celebrity couple in the small village, an artist and a dancer. They enjoy some happy years together. Their house was this one, 29 Rue Adanson. Prior to their marriage, Jane is listed as head of the household, and her occupation is listed as artist. Her servant, Constance Julie Moutot, lives here as well with Maurice, Jane and Jane's son. But after 1911, the servant disappears from the records. In the population census of 1921, Maurice is listed as head of the household. He works at a design bureau, and Jane is listed as wife and homemaker. On weekdays, Maurice takes the omnibus train to his job in Paris and returns in the evenings. Jane's son spends weekdays at a boarding school in Paris. After a time, Jane goes to Maurice's firm to plead with the director, and she learns that he hasn't worked there for over a month or so. He's been dismissed due to bad and irresponsible behavior. He disappears from home without a word from time to time, and he lies about where he's been. Jane had to sell much of her jewelry and her art to make up for the bad times that was caused by Maurice's behavior. Despite his behavior, he did treat her dearly, and she loved him in return. He doesn't come off as someone who is, well, downright evil and nasty. He likely had very severe mental health issues, and my own personal guess is bipolar disorder. In 1914, World War I breaks out, and Maurice is one of the first from Jouy-en-Josas to enlist in the French army, and Jane is on the verge of a nervous breakdown. When he returns home a few weeks later, and she sees him wearing a uniform with his hair cut short, she cries and flings herself into his arms. They did share a bond of love and affection, which his reckless behavior made impossible. She dances for war charities and engages herself in the war effort, organizing in women's groups. The image of her dancing in her 1890s clothes in front of overworked ammunition makers, Red Cross workers, mutilated soldiers and refugees really sets a tone of an age that has passed, clashing with the grim realities of war. In 1817, she receives news that her friend Theodore de Visseva has died. The news of this, her dear friend's passing, and the war make her depressed. And on top of this, at age 21, her son leaves home to never be heard of again. Jean-Pierre Adolphe Biais is described as only having warmed up to his mother when seeing her practice dance steps in front of her full-body mirror. Documents shows that her son enlists in the army in 1917. He is at the time living in a patronage school for young unruly people in Paris, and he's working as a telephone operator. He injures his leg early on in World War I, but serves until 1920. He serves again in 1927 and one more time in 1936. Jean-Pierre does civil service in 1940. He is thereafter captured, imprisoned, and is released 1 year later in 1941. He marries in 1933. Jane knows absolutely nothing of this. In 1951, he is recommended to become a member of the Legion of Honor, since he is unemployed and his war injury prevents him from work. He becomes a knight in the Legion of Honor in that same year. Jean-Pierre Adolphe Biais dies age 57 on the 15th of March 1954 in Casablanca, Morocco. The fact that I know more of what happened to him than Jane, his own mother, is simply harrowing to me. During the war years, she knitted scarves and socks for soldiers, made fine lace to sell, and even painted little country scenes to sell to help with the war effort. She came together with all the other local women of Jouy. She organized bazaars with them, sent parcels, and shared each other's joys and worries. She queued for food, visited wounded soldiers, took first aid lessons, and served in canteens. She had one really close friend here in Jouy, English woman, Marie Laurent. Maurice visits his home when he's on a leave. Him and Jane share some happy moments together. 1918 marks the end of World War I, and Maurice returns home. He is though wounded after a gas attack, and Jane goes to see him in a military hospital. She barely recognizes him. He does recover though. There is no mention of the Spanish flu, which was sweeping over Europe at this time, in either Jane's memoirs or the biography. Maurice's behavior of being absent and returning home penniless reoccurs in the 1920s. He steals things from their home, and he disappears again and again. One day, Jane finds a suitcase hidden under a pile of rugs in his studio. The suitcase contains women's clothing and toilet articles, as well as some correspondence where it's revealed that it's actually Maurice himself who wears these clothes in certain sections of the Paris underworld. Realizing this, Jane felt shame and anger, especially mad over the fact that his family saw her as the dancing girl who had snatched their respectable son. There is no answer as to why he did this, if he was transgendered in a contemporary sense, if he was a transvestite, or had other queer identity. One day he disappears, and Jane makes no effort in finding him. In 1926, she receives a letter that says he's passed away in a sanatorium in Gorbio, close to Nice. His body is transported back to Paris for the burial at Père Lachaise cemetery, and Jane is described as feeling little or no emotions for this man who let her down so very many times. After Maurice's final disappearance, she can no longer afford to keep her house. So she moves here, to the square in Jouy-en-Josas, to a room that the postman and his wife rents to her. She gets some support financially from the Biais family, and she also receives a war widow's pension. She makes her life work and get by with knitting and making fine lace that she sells. In Jane's room there was a poster made by Toulouse-Lautrec of her, the one where she has a coiling snake on her dress. There was a portrait of her by her husband, a radio set, books by Proust, Colette and Baudelaire, as well as a battered cookbook. She still had many of the clothes that she wears in Toulouse-Lautrec's images. In 1924, she's contacted by a journalist from Comédia, a legendary French cultural paper, who writes a story about her life. He describes her as the imaginative and charming simplicity of the story, the words that blossom so clear in her pupils, the intense expression of that look that envelopes in passing, the phrases spoken in a nuanced, exquisite voice. All this gives charm to Jane Avril's talk. She expresses herself with the elegance of a grande dame. Jane is quoted saying, "I humbly admit that I sang like a pig," regarding one time at the Jardin de Paris when she tried her fortune with singing and dancing. And at one time in the theatre business, one of her colleagues said, "Jane, we can't do anything. You are too shy." Hereafter starts a kind of retro interest in things from La Belle Époque, the 1890s, which lasts into the 1930s. In 1931, a Toulouse-Lautrec retrospective opens at the Museum of Decorative Arts. Jane is present at the opening, and an article is written about her appearance here at the opening and about her life. It's called Jane Avril, the famous, the only survivor of the famous quadrille at the Moulin Rouge. In it, her modest life is described. She visits the poor of her region and tries to help them every day. She mentions writing her memoirs, but she says she thinks it's preposterous to think that they would be of interest to the current generation, which has little leisure for reading, being too busy with records and sports. Her voice is described as pleasant and gentle, intelligent and vivacious. An interesting note to me is that she's referred to as unwomanly, not resembling a woman, but a child, or as otherworldly, a flower or a fairy, both in old age and in young age. And this is simply disgusting and really outdated way to speak of an adult woman. But the wording otherworldly and unwomanly is interesting to me, as it helps to set the tone of her in her time as an outsider, yet with a certain allure. Her life starts again as new people seek her out, as well as people from her past. That same year, 1931, an English journalist named Jose Shercliff seeks her out. Jose is 29 years old, and she's read the article that followed after the Toulouse-Lautrec retrospective. Jose is to write Jane's biography in 1952. Jose knocked on Jane's door. There were quick, tripping steps behind it. The door opened, and a lively face popped out. Jose recognized Jane from the Toulouse-Lautrec pictures. She writes, "The eyes had not changed. They were deep-set and of the clearest green, with an almost impish expression. The tip of her fine little nose twitched like the nostrils of a delicate rabbit, and her smile was the smile of the young girl of whom I had seen a photo of in one of the reviews." Jose presented her with flowers. Jane stood for a moment with such a look of delight on her face, as if they had been a casket of jewels. "Oh, les fleurs, les jolies fleurs, le printemps enfin," she said. And she flung her arms around Jose's neck and kissed her on both cheeks. To Jane, Jose was already a friend. For an hour or so, Jane talked, with a face alive with emotion and with shining eyes. Her ringless hands made dancing gestures, and one foot seemed to tap the rhythm of her thoughts. Would I like to see how she still could kick her height? She stood up and slowly raised one slender, still muscular leg until it was on the side of her ear. Jane also showed Jose notes she had made for a memoir. They correspond thereafter and meet up again. They chat for hours, and Jose brings Jane's memoirs back with her to Paris. Jane visits Jose regularly in Paris, indulges herself in theaters and cafes on her once so familiar streets. She had baths at Jose's place. She bought herself a new hat and she went to the hairdresser. Some days she felt young and energized, and other days she felt old and weary, refusing to leave her home. In 1933, Jane's memoirs are published periodically in the Parisian newspaper Paris Midi, who pay her for writing this. Jose had plans of an English translation, but she left it for later. In 2021, it was translated to English with the help of an online translator by me. With her renewed life at age 66, she decides to move back to Paris. And after staying a while at an old folks home she didn't like, and staying for some time with friends, she moves here to Foundation Madame Lebaudy on Rue de la Saïda. It's a home for old cultural workers and stage actors. Her small room had a mini kitchen and a balcony. On the wall she hung the Toulouse-Lautrec poster of her with the snake dress, a tiny picture, a painting that her husband had made of their home in Jouy, an old barometer and a flowery calendar. She also brought her much-loved radio set. She felt instantly at home here. She called her co-tenants the old girls. Some were several years younger than her. May 31st in 1935, there's a Toulouse-Lautrec ball held here at Moulin de la Galette in Montmartres, and Jane is invited to perform. She is promised a replica of one of her own gowns from the 1890s. She's really happy and proud to be included. This ball was attended by such celebrities of the day, such as Josephine Baker, Kees van Dongen, Miss Donget, and Colette. Her journalist friend Jose goes to seek her out before her performance and finds Jane standing behind a screen, wretched. The wonderful costume she's been promised turns out to be a travesty. And she's crying. She's saying she won't dance. She refuses to do it. She stands in a pink and green frock with shoulders bare and blue with cold, and cries and cries. But she did do it. She did dance. And she was so agile still she could raise her leg to be on the level of her ear. She poses for pictures with poses such as in her youth. She looks happy in the pictures. Afterwards she feels ashamed though, and doesn't want to talk about the experience. After her performance, she comes down with a severe cold, and later she's diagnosed with angina. Sometime later, Jane is contacted by a woman who turns out to be the ex-girlfriend of her son. They had a child together, and thus Jane learned that she was a grandmother. The woman, whom Jose, Jane's biographer, calls Renee, is an orphaned girl who lives with her child in a convent where she works in exchange for housing and food. Jane's son had left Renee and the child. A letter exchange starts between them, between Jane and Renee, and Jane sends them gifts and whatever means she can spare to help her newfound daughter-in-law and grandson. She's interviewed by several people among others Gerstel Mack, who writes a biography on Toulouse-Lautrec. One day she hears on her radio of a singer who calls herself Jane Avril. She writes to the radio station and they forward her message with a suggestion that she change her name to Rose Avril. The singer herself responds and pardons and says she did not know that this name already belonged to a famous person. She takes the name as Jane suggested. Rose later invites Jane to come and see her in concert. A Toulouse-Lautrec exhibition opens in Paris in 1938 at Galerie Knoedler. Jane is present at the opening, and it is described that she couldn't resist to dance a few steps. As if she had heard an orchestra, she discreetly danced a few steps among the surprised visitors. 70 years old, she danced through the halls, which were filled with the images by Toulouse-Lautrec, made in her youth. It is now 1939, and Jane's health is deteriorating. She suffers from chills, hemorrhages, failing eyesight, and her last teeth are to be pulled. She's also depressed. More and more of her old friends start to die, and Jane ponders if fate has decided that she should outlive them all. Jose Shercliff and her friends decide to arrange a benefit concert to help Jane. Reluctantly, she agrees to it, as she was proud and hated asking for money. But she was in debt after paying expenses due to her ill health, and the costs of living were also rising. The concert was held here at 9 p.m. on the 22nd of June 1939 at Salle de l'École Normale de Musique. The program included singer Yvette Guibert and mime and dancer Bella Reine, who was specialized in the period around Toulouse-Lautrec and interpreted his images with mime. An article is written prior to the concert about her and about the event. One funny note in it is that the 1890s poster girl says, "I really hate advertising, this plague of our time." She also says, the French cancan was not as standardized as it is now. The figures were more nuanced, and nowadays they all dance to the rhythm of the gallop. And if you had seen me as a single dancer. And saying that, Jane executed a few steps in front of the interviewer, steps that were full of elegance. The benefit concert was not really a monetary success, but the small profit did allow for her to go on a rest retreat in Normandy, where she also met up with her daughter-in-law and grandson. She found Renée to be as sweet as she had imagined, and her grandson to be a little darling. Renée's real name was Marguerite Leutier. Jane's son marries a woman with this name in 1933. She and her son lived close to Douarnenez in Bretagne. Marguerite dies in Nantes the 1st of February 1974 at age 70. No one knows what happened to Jane's grandson. If he's still living, he is around 90 years old in present time. On her return to Paris, she sees the start of World War II. The news speak only of the war, and people start hoarding and blacking out their windows. Jane refused to go into air raid shelters, as she feared the cold and damp more than a death from an airstrike. One of her strong emotions during this time is her intense and personal hatred of Hitler. She says one of his dancing girls ought to blow herself up with a stick of dynamite and take him with her. On the 14th of June in 1940, Paris fell to Nazi Germany. Jane rarely goes out, except for buying food. She listens to the news in desolation. Jose, who is a journalist, warns her that she might have to leave, and leave suddenly. Jane wept. She waved goodbye to Jose from a balcony, and this was the last time they saw one another. Jane saw German troops in Paris, and she detested them. Life in the old folks' home is sorrowful, and the city is mostly only women and children. Jane lived only for one thing: to see the Germans turned out of France. She does have one final adventure though. She's invited to a matinee where she meets ex-Queen of Portugal, Amelia, who had seen Jane dance in her heyday. The winter of 1942 to 43 was a particularly harsh one. There was starvation and desperation in Paris. Jane had problems sleeping, and she stayed up, knitting and listening to her radio. On the 27th of September 1941, she writes in a letter to actor Sacha Guitry and asks him to help her change retirement home to one in Ris-Orangis, outside of Paris. She's ashamed to be asking for help. She's very poor and sickly, and she writes that she has no one else who helps her. In other letters to Mime Bellarraine, she writes about her health issues and that doctors have advised her to stay in bed due to the heat, and her eye is swollen due to a ruptured vessel. The doctors strongly advise her to operate, but she did nothing, and luckily it didn't get any worse. Jane writes in agony over the fact that she is always sick. She dies on the 17th of January, 1943, in the old folks' home on Rue de la Saida. Two of the old girls, her friends in the home, is present when she is dying. She had lost her ability to speak, so her last words were written, and she wrote, "What a martyrdom I suffer." And underneath it she wrote, "I hate Hitler." Jane Avril is buried here, at Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, in Maurice's family tomb. She was buried here on the 20th of January, 1943, and some of her close friends were present at the funeral. In the last paragraph of her 1933 memoir, she writes, "It happens to me while sleeping, that I dream I am still dancing. Barely and rarely putting the tip of my toe to the ground, I fly away lightly, and everyone I have ever loved is smiling at me from below."